Hello again, welcome back to India Global Week. I'm Ben Thompson, and as promised before the break, we're going to turn our attention now to events in China, because of course in recent weeks China finding itself in the global headlines for maybe all the wrong reasons. Questions around the COVID-19 outbreak, the new national security law for Hong Kong, growing assertiveness of China on the world stage. All of that's meant it's been pretty difficult for organizations, for economies, for global policymakers to really work out what's happening and how they maintain relations with China. So how should the international community deal with China? And given the opportunities that are clearly there, what is the best way to progress national interest as far as China is concerned? I've got a great panel to talk me through some of the implications of that over the next 45 minutes or so. So let me introduce you to them. With us, Weijian Shan, who is the chairman and chief executive of PAG. That's the Hong Kong-based private equity firm. It's got $38 billion under capital management. His firm invests throughout Asia and beyond. Hoping to join us a little later is Gareth Price. He's senior research fellow at Chatham House. He leads research on South Asia. Previously an analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit focused on South Asia. Also with us, Professor Rana, the director of the University China Centre and professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford. He's the author of several books, including China's War with Japan, The Struggle for Survival. That was Book of the Year in the Financial Times and elsewhere. His latest book is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a Nationalist Future. And also with us, Rajeswari Pillai, Rajagopalan, who is the head of Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation. She joined the ORF after a 5-year stint at the National Security Council Secretariat at the Indian government. Also authored and edited 9 books on military strategy and nuclear security relating to Asia and particularly China. So welcome to you all. Great to have you on the panel. And as we said, I'm hoping that Gareth is able to join us very shortly. But maybe I could start with you, Weijian Shan. Look, let's talk about COVID-19 because that's the issue that's most dominated headlines for China lately. Is it a reputational issue for China now? Is this just a blip or is it a long-term concern?
Well, actually, COVID-19 situation in China is very much under control. I would say 3 months ago, it was very much in the headlines and in the social media. But these days, the country has gone back to work, and there are some clusters here and there, but by and large, the situation is very much under control. It is outside of China that the situation, especially in the United States, the situation is not so much under control and maybe even out of control. I think that at this point, the Chinese are more focused on the economy. By that I mean economic recovery, given the fact that the first quarter was very severely hit by the pandemic and the lockdowns.
Yeah, quite clearly two very different issues here, aren't they? Both for economies around the world, their domestic recovery, but also the way that they therefore perceive China, because there are lots of concerns, aren't there, about whether there was a cover-up, whether China is the source of this, as President Trump would have us believe. I wonder, therefore, as you said, domestically, the problem may seem to be going away, but internationally, does China have a reputation problem?
Well, apparently it does, but I don't know what you can do about it. And when you look at the way that China handled this particular virus, of course, there are many ways to improve the initial stages of handling the outbreak. But it was something quite new. And once the central government became fully aware of the extent and severity of this particular virus, I think they took quite drastic actions, including sealing off a city of 11 million people, which I think was probably the first time that the human history has ever seen. Nonetheless, I think it could have done better. The local government could have assumed person-to-person infection. It took them about 10 days to realize that. Initially, they thought it would only jump from animals or from meat to people. But if you look at the timeline of how this thing evolved, from December 27th, when a first hospital, a Dr. Zhang Jixian, first discovered this unusual infection. She tested 3 patients against all known viruses and discovered that this was something new, although not identified, to the alert to WHO as well as to CDC in Wuhan City and in Beijing. It took only less than 24 hours. And so I think that, of course, you can always be critical in retrospect of how somebody has handled the pandemic. But under the circumstances, I would say that you have to give them some credit for bringing this under control. To date, the total number of infections in China is only 80,000. That's total for the entire country. And that mostly happened, of course, before March. And the total number of deaths is about 4,600, which is very small in comparison with other countries for a country with a population of 1.4 billion. Now, if you look at the situation in the United States, of course, it's very bad. The number of infections has exceeded 3 million. Number of deaths has exceeded 130,000. And there's a lot of failure in trying to contain the spread of this virus. And it's also understandable that politicians would like to deflect the criticism on themselves. And of course, China is an easy target to attack at this point, given the fact that that's where it started. But I must add one particular point. Not every pandemic originated from China. SARS obviously was, and this one was, but H1N1, which happened in 2009, was first discovered in the United States, Midwest part of the United States. And it lasted about 16 months and spread all over the world. Eventually, about 250,000 people died from that particular disease. So this is a public health alarm for the entire world that we need to do better as international body, as the world population, to prepare for pandemics of this kind.
Let me bring in our other panelists. Professor Rana, do we have to give China credit for how it has handled this crisis, as we just heard there from Weijian and Shan?
I think Shan's assessment that we've had just now is a very fair one. The context I'd give is this. One of the messages that has been coming out of parts of China, and not all of it, because I think actually there are different voices. If you read Chinese social media, and I know that Shan is quite a fan of that, and many people wanting to know what people think in China, will be often very surprised by quite how varied the opinions actually are online. They're much better. If you go and read things like the People's Daily, which are essentially dictated from the top in Beijing, you won't learn anything terribly exciting. But seeing what people are really saying online, I think is very helpful in that context. And one of the things that I think is fair is that there is a great deal of public popularity and support for the solutions that the Chinese government took. People do, and I speak to my own Chinese students and friends in China, they do feel that overall the government's done well. The point of comparison I would make, to add to Shan's, if I may, is this. There is no necessary benefit in having a highly authoritarian society like China's and being able to control disease. The countries that overall head-to-head have done the best are New Zealand, South Korea, and of course the territory of Taiwan, which China does not recognize as a separate territory, but which of course has been autonomous since the days of the Cold War. All of these places have done fantastically well in terms of maintaining strong liberal and democratic values, as well as really controlling the virus very, very effectively and getting massive public buy-in for the way that they approach these questions. So I think really what the Chinese example shows is that, yes, absolutely, I would say that China has controlled the virus extremely well, but this is not not a test of authoritarianism versus democracy. We can find examples of both types of state being able to control the virus very, very successfully.
Rajeswari, let me bring you in here, if I can. Sorry,
two places
I'll come back to you in just a second, Weijian. I just want to get the thoughts of Rajeswari here, because I just want to talk about the implications for China's reputation globally. Give me your thoughts on that if we can.
No, absolutely. I agree with both the panelists from before. But I think that China's missteps, such as letting the pandemic spread in the initial stages, there were questions about reporting, how much reporting, what kind of reporting was permitted, the initial cover-up to the extent of the pandemic spread in China for fear of seniors or the hierarchical system. I believe that led to the massive spread within China as well as to the rest of the world. But after that, they managed to bring it under control. But I think the initial stages, the initial manner in which China went about handling the pandemic spread, I think there is quite a bit to it. So one is to look at the China's missteps, such as letting the pandemic spread. Second, focusing more on China's shifting the blame rather than investigating the origin of the virus. I think that went on for a while. Third, again, using the pandemic aid for publicity, again, something that boomeranged in the case of China for a bit. And of course, I think what has perplexed everybody in the neighborhood as well as in the larger Asian context is the aggressive, assertive military behavior that towards all of its neighbors. So is that a part of the cover-up that China is undertaken? I think that's part of the kind of questions, because it's very difficult to pinpoint and say as to what is driving China's behavior. So is that the domestic handling of the coronavirus pandemic part of the rationale for the kind of assertive or rather aggressive Chinese behavior towards every single neighborhood, neighbor, or even beyond, actually? So it's a lot of things, sort of interconnected in some ways. Domestic handling, one issue, but also the boomeranging of some of the, sending the defective protective PPE kits and the testing kits, all of that has had a negative impact on the image of China. So the Chinese aggressive behavior that you see today towards all of its neighbors, is that a sort of a cover-up, in a sense, for that mishandling of the pandemic issue domestically as well as internationally?
Yeah, and that's absolutely the issue I wanted to come on, because I'm keen to move this beyond the COVID crisis and look at what China's ambitions are globally and the impact that it has on the world economy. Gareth Price, welcome to you. Good to have you with us. Gareth Price, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. It's great to have you here. I'll come to you in just a moment. But Weijian, let me come back to you, because given what we've heard, therefore, about the handling of the crisis and, the different views both within and externally of China about how this crisis was dealt with, does China have many friends on the world stage right now?
Apparently not.
And what would you say on that context? Because, China has global ambitions. It needs relations with other countries to fulfill those ambitions. How much harder is it now, given what we've seen over recent months, than it was maybe this time last year?
Of course, I cannot speak on behalf of China. And I study China the same way as all of you do. But it seems to me that the Chinese diplomacy is somewhat in disarray at this particular moment. I refer to what Raji has just said. I don't think there's necessarily a connection between the pandemic and the diplomatic relationship with this country or that country. And neither do I think that there is, not apparent to me at least, a relationship between the relationship with one country and the relationship with another country. And it seems to me that there's some chaos in that particular regard. If you just look at Chinese diplomats kind of asserting themselves in different places in different ways. Some more moderate than others, some more muted than others. It doesn't seem that it is very well coordinated. That's my observation. From outside, of course.
Gareth Price, let me bring you in here at this point. And you may have missed just at the start of the discussion, we were looking at some of this sort of reputational impact of the handling of the coronavirus crisis from China. As I said, I'm keen to move this on beyond that and talk about China's ambitions. So perhaps, given your background and your research, sum up for us, if you would, what are China's ambitions right now on a global stage?
We can't hear.
You may need to unmute yourself.
Apologies. Many technical issues.
No, there we go. No worries. It's good to have you with us.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can hear you at this point, Gareth. I'm really sorry. Just bear with us, though. I will come back to you while we try and sort out some of those audio issues with your line. Maybe let me bring in Professor Rana then on that point. Talk me through, if you will, because you've studied this extensively. What are China's ambitions right now, and where does that figure in terms of the world stage, where other countries fit into that grand plan?
Absolutely. Well, if I could pick you up, Ben, or perhaps in the conversation you just had with Shan about whether China has any friends. Actually, Shan, I think China has lots of friends around the world. The problem is that right now, a lot of people in Beijing think that your friends are the people who tell you everything you want to hear and never tell you anything that's difficult or awkward. I find that my real friends are very keen to tell me at great length where I've got things wrong and where I can improve. So I think it may be the definition of friendship that needs to be examined there as well. And perhaps as things calm down a bit, there'll be more opportunity for real friends, frank friends, to talk to each other. The rise of China, I think, is being seen in a variety of different frameworks. One, of course, is economic, and I think that we have to mention, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's immensely important when we're talking in the context of India, because, of course, India is not taking part in the Belt and Road Initiative. India's neighbor, Pakistan, of course, is very much part of that, as part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And I think one of the challenges for China is, first of all, to show that particularly in the current economic crisis, the positive parts of BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, being able, for instance, to provide new investment capital, something that, of course, Shan knows a huge amount about, to help improve the economies of places in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, that element is really carried on, rather than simply being a sort of debt vehicle at a time of economic retrenchment for China. But also a more difficult question, and this is one that I've talked to many Chinese friends and interlocutors about and haven't yet had a really clear answer, which is, what are the security implications? As China goes global with the BRI, it's not going to be deploying People's Liberation Army troops around the world, I assume. But if that's the case, how does it defend its interests in Central Asia, in South Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa? We've all seen the movie Wolf Warrior, which has become very famous, about Chinese special forces flying around the world, beating up Westerners and then flying people back home to Beijing. But that's a movie, it's not a strategy. So the big question comes as to whether or not China can really provide a genuinely collaborative economic effort through the BRI, as it's showing some signs of doing, to be fair, but whether it's able to reassure the world about its security intentions, which so far still are causing a lot more nervousness, and not just in the West, but also in the wider global South.
Rajeswari, that's a great point to bring you in when we talk about the security issues. Maybe you could elaborate on the point that was raised there by Professor Rana.
Yeah, absolutely. I think BRI is a good case to look at in a sense, and how China has been. There are success cases maybe here and there. I think there have been a few points, but I think there are huge difficulties and challenges also faced by China. They seem to have assumed that this would be a much easier thing for them to do because these countries need infrastructure, connectivity, and so on and so forth. But I think the key question is, do these countries have the capacity to absorb all the kind of infrastructure development investment that China is seeking to do in these countries? And therefore, you have ended up with a Sri Lanka that has had to lease the Hambantota port for 199 years. Similar, the difficult situations in Pakistan, Myanmar, and so on and so forth. So there are issues. I think one has to have a very nuanced perspective in a sense. But on the broader question that you asked, whether on China's global ambitions, I would say it possibly has global ambitions. But if I were to give a regional sense of this, I would say that it is going to be very difficult for China, a long journey for China to even catch up to or try and get to the point where what the US did in terms of establishing the global liberal order, world order, and so on and so forth. China is, of course, developing certain certain aura of a great power, but I think it's going to be a very long time. And in the meantime, there's a bigger problem because China appears to be in a big hurry to get to the high table and sit and dictate to the rest of the world how the world should be run, seem to be in a big hurry, and I think that's part of the problem. And if you look at the region in per se, the Indo-Pacific region, I think there may be worries among these countries about China's global ambitions. But I think far more pertinent for these countries is what the Chinese growing power will come to mean for their own security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The US, on the other hand, could be somewhat more concerned about China's global ambitions because they want to see who's going to try and replace them in a sense. But I think it's a very different sets of concerns for the regional players. So it is the strategic consequences of China's rise which is more pertinent for them. Rebalancing, and there has been certain amount of reluctance, for instance, in the region to balance China. For a very long time, countries did not want to take a clear side between China on the one hand and others. But I think increasingly, especially over the last 6 months, I would say this has pushed many countries to take a firmer stand. For instance, whether it is the kind of naval intrusions that you saw in Indonesian exclusive economic zone in the Natuna Islands, or Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, again, and of course now on the East China Sea, Japan and Taiwan, and of course now with India in the Galvan clash, you have pushed all of these countries to take a clearer position against China. And I think there is a concerted effort now on the part of the like-minded countries to come together and take a firmer position against China. This has been not easy especially for countries like India, which never was comfortable playing the balance of power games. But I think increasingly so, there have been a massive shift in the thinking within India and other countries.
Yeah, fascinating thoughts, actually. Weijian and Shan, let me bring you in here because, as you heard there, a suggestion that China is in a rush to get to the big table and it will take a lot of time. I imagine, given what you do and where you are, you would hope that that would be sooner rather than later. And actually, the pace of of that change speeds up rather than takes the time that was suggested there.
Actually, I don't quite agree with that analysis, that picture that Raji has just painted. I don't think there's concerted effort on the part of China to expand beyond what it has traditionally has done. And if you look at South China Sea disputes, that has been in existence since right after the war or even before the war. And conflicts with this country and that country over disputed territories, over disputed waters. And from where I sit, that is here in Hong Kong, what I see is, of course, China from time to time would get into dispute with particular countries because of overlapping territorial claims, and that's nothing new. It's not just 6 months, past 6 months that we have seen this. And you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, I don't even think that's very well defined, either concept or project. It was some idea for some Chinese companies actually to utilize the overcapacity to build roads and infrastructure in neighboring countries. They thought it made very good economic sense. But I have been invited in the past 5 years to various conferences to talk about Belt and Road initiatives. I have never attended even single one of them because I don't even understand. I don't even know what that concept is. I think it's very loose. It's just an idea. And very often state-owned companies are involved. And as a state-owned companies, they're inefficient, wasteful, and very often they got into very bad projects for which they don't make money. I think it's just waste of resources. And China is much better off focusing on its domestic problems, which historically is what China has been doing for the past 1,000 years. If you look at the difference between the Chinese civilization and Western civilization, when we talk about projection power, the Western civilizations idea of projection power is to go beyond its borders to subjugate, sorry, I forgot that word.
Subjugate. Yep.
Subjugate, other people. And throughout the Chinese history in the past 1,000 years, that has not been the case. China has been focused on building its domestic economy and building a wall, the Great Wall, to defend itself. And the Chinese territory was the largest when it was under foreign occupation in the Mongolian dynasty and in Manchurian dynasty. So I don't see China has an agenda to expand much beyond what it claims to its own territory.
I'm very much enjoying the facial expression of your fellow panelists here as you say certain things there. So let me bring them in. Professor Rana, look, your response to what you heard there from Weijian Shan, and that concept of actually China has a lot of domestic issues itself. Does it need to focus more on those rather than those external ambitions that we quite clearly are most concerned with day to day because they involve other countries, other economies around the world? But does China need to sort out its home market first?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, just to reply slightly to, Shan's excellent analysis, the large part of which I very much agree with. But I would say that we're talking about people outside China's borders. In 1950, I think the people living in South Korea were quite surprised to see the arrival of Chinese and North Korean troops making their way across the 38th parallel. And in 1979, there were a whole bunch of Vietnamese who were very surprised to see Deng Xiaoping's PLA boys turn up over the southwestern border. So not exclusively contained within the borders. Should point out that neither of those, I think both of those, one could say, came to a draw in terms of the end result, and I know the PLA learned a lot in both cases. So just a little insight from a historian there. In terms of looking forward, I think it's important. I think one of the areas that actually China does have to be very wary about, and it goes back to my first comments about China understanding who its friends are. One of the aspects of the new national security law, which has just been passed relating to Hong Kong, which actually hasn't been much noticed, but will need to be much more debated, and I think actually the rest of the world will have things to say to China about it, is the aspiration to try and control comments about China from the outside world. So, for instance, let's just say an analyst sitting in New Delhi who says something, pretty critical of what the PLA or the CCP is up to in China could potentially, under this law, be said to be committing some kind of criminal act. In the way that the United States tries to control global use of the dollar, it looks as if one interpretation of this law might be for China to try and control global use of free speech about what people think about China. Now, it's obviously completely unacceptable, as China often says to the rest of the world, to try and control free speech inside anyone else's borders. So I'm sure that China itself will be looking to amend the law quite quickly to make clear it doesn't mean that. But secondly, as I've said, the major problem I think that China has to trying to become a global player is not the aspiration. I think there are a lot of people who think that right now the world is not being run by the big powers in a very effective way. And the place for a responsible, stable China at the top global table actually would be very welcome in many quarters. But the China we have now has one fatal fundamental problem that it can only solve itself. Outside powers can do nothing to help on this. And that is being able to understand and take criticism and be able to deal with discussion of its own role in a way that grown-ups do. At the moment, one thing I hear often from Chinese analysts, because I talk to a lot of them, is the statement that China is a teenager, it's just finding out its strength, it's kind of stretching its muscles. It's always quite a gendered statement, I think. It's always assumed, I think this is a male teenager, but anyway, we can get back to that aspect in one sense. And of course, teenagers have to grow, whether it's in the global community or elsewhere. But it's also the case that teenagers turn into adults, and adults have responsibilities, and adults know that the world is complex, and you can't just have people saying you're fantastic and wonderful the whole time and fly into tantrums and rages when it's not the case. It's only China's friends who will tell it that kind of awkward reality. And it's a long time, I think. It will take a long time, but I hope it'll be a shorter time when China's able to have that more grown-up conversation with the rest of the world.
Rajeswari, is that fair assessment? Is China a sulky, moody teenager that needs to grow up?
Absolutely, and I think that's precisely the point, because I say that they seem to be in a haste to be there. They will get there. They will become the number one power, but I think it's going to be several decades before they get to develop the aura and develop the characteristics of actually a mature superpower. And in the India-China context, there was an essay that was written in the War on the Rocks that actually kind of tried to provide a Weijian perspective in understanding as to why China is behaving the way it is doing. And I think it did talk about, one, of course, the covering up of the domestic issue and so on and so forth. But I think the other aspect was that China is so paranoid. If China has become so paranoid and insecure about itself, then there is only that much that the others in the neighborhood or in the larger region can do to sort of calm down China in a sense. One point on the Weijian's excellent understanding and trying to provide the rationale in a sense, I think China was an accommodative power. China was a benign power until a couple of decades ago, at least for the last decade. Ever since at least Xi Jinping came into office, China has been asserting gradually, and I think you have seen a much more assertive, aggressive behavior in the last few years. Ask any of the neighbors, they will tell you the story, how they feel violated in a sense. And I think, yeah, it's absolutely true that there are disputed areas. So China China and India, for instance, or China and Vietnam, all of these are contested areas. We have land borders, we have maritime disputes between various neighbors. But the fact is that China does not believe that these are contested areas. They do not acknowledge that these are contested areas. It claims each of these territories as its own and then behaves in that fashion. And I think that's part of the problem. At least start by acknowledging that these are contested territories. We cannot use force. Use of force is not the way to go about. You need to have dialogue and negotiations as the way to go about. There are peaceful ways in which these issues can be dealt with, and that's hopefully the way. Hopefully, China will find that it needs to go out. Otherwise, China is not going to be left with very many friends. Like I said, the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, was very, very reluctant to talk about or to take sides. But I think increasingly, each of these neighbors talk about the Quad Plus engagement that has picked up in the context of the COVID-19, which includes countries such as Vietnam. Okay, that's been already a big party in the context. But countries like New Zealand, South Korea, being part of this Quad Plus arrangement, it does clearly show that these countries have also had to deal with or bear the brunt of the Chinese aggressive behavior in their own neighborhood. South Pacific is a case in point as to why New Zealand has become much more forceful at this point. New Zealand has actually followed a very similar trajectory that of India. India did not want to take sides. India never wanted, basically, given that we are neighbors, immediate neighbors, and we should be having a decent working relationship, a great economic ties, and so on and so forth. But I think even countries like India, New Zealand, and South Korea, again, are forced to take clear positions when it comes to how we deal with the strategic consequences of the rise of China factor.
I'm aware time is tight, so I want to get thoughts from each of you, if I can, so relatively briefly, on the opportunities now, because it's very easy for us to look at some of the risks maybe of that global expansion. But, businesses that are watching this right around the world right now, Weijian, Shan, where are you most excited about the opportunities involving China? Where could anyone watching this get involved in that growth and that ambition that China is demonstrating globally?
I'm put into somewhat unfortunate position of speaking for China, which is not my role. I'm simply
I won't ask you to speak for China, but maybe you can demonstrate in your role, because quite clearly at the private equity firm, you are looking around the economy, you're looking around the world at where the exciting opportunities are. How do you see them?
Yes, I'm coming to it. My firm, PAG, manages $38 billion. We invest throughout Asia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, Australia, all included, and sometimes we go beyond the region. From our point of view, the growth potential in Asia is tremendous. And when it comes to private equity investments, we are most active in China and India, two large economies with a growing economy. And at this particular moment, I would say that the potential in China is even greater than that of the India, but India is coming up very, very quickly. So from our point of view, the entire region presents good investment opportunities to global investors who we represent. We manage their money. We try to generate good returns for them. So to us, the Chinese economy is critically important, and the Indian economy is critically important, and the rest of Asia as well.
Professor Rana, where do you see the opportunity right now?
Well, like Shan, I don't represent anyone except my own views as an academic. Unfortunately, as an academic, that means by definition I'm obscure and my views shouldn't make it any difference to anyone. But in this particular case, having been, I think, quite speaking strongly about where I think that there are issues for China in the world, I want to make it clear that I think that China, being a major presence in the world, is a really important opportunity in terms of China's record in poverty reduction, in terms of its growth of literacy, in terms of the way in which it's become an investor in a whole variety of parts of the global south, which have found it very difficult to get investment from the rest of the world, and in terms of efforts in absolutely existential areas like climate change also. I think these are areas where it's actually very important to understand that the rest of the world has to work with China. There's been a lot of criticism of China's role in the United Nations at the World Health Organization from President Trump. I think the point that you have to push back against this on is that China is now the second biggest payer into the WHO. It's perfectly open to the US and to us in the West to be paying more into the World Health Organization and the UN rather than, in the case of the US, pulling out of it. So I think more leadership on the Western Front from Britain, from the United States and from Europe about how we provide a genuine new collaborative world order is a really important part of that. We must expect a lot from China, but we must also expect even more from ourselves in the West. And this has to be a cooperative conversation. There is no way that the second biggest economy in the world and a major source of global norms and governance can be excluded. And that's where I see the promise lying, I hope, for a new, much more cooperative conversation post-COVID.
Rajeswari, a final word from you. So it's about collaboration. It's about working with China.
Absolutely, and thank you. And I think I will take off from where Professor Rana left off in a sense. You have a lot of opportunities because China is also given that they are the second largest economy in the world. They can be brought to the table to collaborate, to be a responsible stakeholder in whether it is in terms of dealing with the sustainable development goals, so on and so forth. I think I entirely agree with him. But I think the COVID-19, for instance, also brought home the importance of paying attention to the multilateral agencies to ensure that they remain effective and they are not beholden to one single power. And I think India, for instance, now being part of the WHO Board of Governance, is also working with the like-minded countries to promote greater neutrality, transparency, accountability in such agencies so that the responsibilities are carried out in a professional manner. So the need to review and reform the functioning of multilateral agencies, I think, is absolutely critical. Again, China has to be part and parcel of these negotiations. Nobody is talking about containing China, but how do we get China to play by the rules of the road? How do we get China to respect international law and play by it? Because today, for instance, if you're questioning China, it is almost seen as if you heard the Foreign Affairs Ministry spokesperson, he said you're questioning the international law and norms. So I think that there needs to be a better understanding of what we are talking about and how we can make China play by the same rules of the game that we have been part of. Second, I think I cannot, especially given that the Sino-Indian border clash has just ended and we still have not gotten to a full disengagement process. So I think we are still caught up in that. There is an impasse at this point of time. I cannot see where India and China will collaborate in a bilateral fashion or in a regional framework. There, I would think that there is a sort of a manifestation among a large number of countries to come together to address a common security concern, which is China's aggressive aggressive behavior. And these have provided an opportunity for a lot of these Indo-Pacific powers to come together, establish and nurture the rules-based order, and get everybody to play by the rules of the game. And this is not just a rhetoric, because India has been part and parcel of it. India, for instance, in the way it dealt with a territorial dispute with Bangladesh, for instance, it was a sort of a ruling that came out from the Permanent Court of Arbitration was not in favor of India, but India did play by. So it's not just a rhetoric for countries like India and others in the region. But I think getting everybody to play by the same rules of the road, respect international law, find peaceful ways of dealing with territorial and sovereignty issues. I think these are the some of the issues, and these have provided an opportunity for the region to come together in addressing the larger problem in the region.
May I say something here?
Yes, we have maybe 1 minute, so you have a little bit of time.
Yes.
Go for it.
I think you speak from the assumption that China wants a different world order than what we have today. And China is breaking the rules of the world order. I don't think that's the case. From my perspective, again, I'm observing China and other countries from a neutral standpoint view. I think China is very eager to play by international rules, to operate within multilateral framework. And if you look at the United States, okay, in the past 2 years, it has pulled out Paris Accord, of which China is a member, pulled out TPP, they pull out Iranian nuclear accord, they pull out intermediate missile agreement with Russia, pull out the open sky agreement involving 37 countries, pull out WHO, is fundamentally undermined WTO. It also imposed sanctions on international civil courts, criminal courts, for investigating American soldiers in Afghanistan on their conduct. So it seems to me that to a large extent, the United States is tearing down, destroying a world order that the United States itself has established, which China very much would like to be part of. So that assumption that every conflict was initiated by China for its own purposes, I just don't think is the truth.
I'm grateful to you all. We could talk about this all day, and I would flag anyone who's interested in this issue. We had a fascinating discussion yesterday on the first stream, talking about the role of multilateral institutions right now and whether they are still relevant, whether their purpose still exists, and given that battle between China and the United States, whether there is still a relevance to those institutions. So do check that out. You can do so online. But my thanks to our guests on this panel. It's been fascinating to hear your thoughts. Weijian, Shan, Professor Rana and Rajeswari Rajagopalan. I'm really grateful for your thoughts and to hear how we may progress from here, but it really does underline that difference in opinion, doesn't it? So thank you to all. Thank you to you too for watching. We're going to talk more after this little break. We're going to look at betting big on India is the title of the session. We're going to examine some of the investment opportunities there and where the growth may come. It's a big issue. We've got plenty of time over the next couple of sessions, so stay tuned for that. We'll see you soon.